begin the current Daf, Pesachim Daf. We begin on the bottom of the New Testament base, folding up from the bottom of the Yomim. But the Gemara begins explaining the halacha of our previous Mishnah that we began on the previous Daf regarding when one slaughters a korban Pesach, one does one of the avodas shalei lishma, which invalidates. Now our Gemara discusses the parameters of the halacha. She's corresponds to B'kam Zechon Chesko to any type of Davchain. Pishem is joining us for today's Daf. Something we're going to discuss in today's Daf is like we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. Korban Pesach that was slaughtered shalei lishma, or you received the blood, or you transported the blood in the Beis Hamikdash, or you sprayed it shalei lishma. It's going to be possible. Then we introduce a case where it's lishmai and shalei lishmai, or it's shalei lishmai and lishmai. So the Gemara is going to have a discussion regarding is the time of a Mishnah like Rabbi Meir or like Rabbi Yossi. That depends on how you define the case of the Mishnah. Additionally, in the Gemara's discussion is regarding any day other than Erev Pesach. Interestingly, a korban Pesach can be brought as a shlamim. So although it's really a korban Pesach, that's only an Erev Pesach. If you bring the korban Pesach any other day of the year, actually it's valid as a shlamim. And we'll see as that relates to the discussion of lishma and shalei lishma. Mechashim and ma'avod l'avoid is the concept that one can have a machshava of psul when you're doing, let's say, shchita for the zrika. You can have a machshava which makes something pigul or pasal that's shalei lishma. That the idea that not only could you have the avodah, the machshava in this avodah to invalidate, but even for a different avodah to invalidate. The concept of stam l'shmakai is that we presume generally that something is being done for its appropriate namesake, and even if one didn't have a specific machshava. So we begin the current Daf, and the Testament base 4 lines on the bottom of the Yomit. Says the Gemara, Bayirapal. We opened up, we said in the mission, like we said, if someone has a machshava of shalei lishma by any one of the four avodah is going to be possible. And then we said that let's say he does it lishmai and shalei lishmai, not one or the other, not only lishma or shalei lishmai. He had both in mind, lishmai and shalei lishmai, or shalei lishmai and lishmai. There's going to be possible also. So Papa asked the following question: Avodah achas tanan? Were these two machshavas in the same avodah? Or were we saying in two different avodas? Again, there's four avodas: shchita, kabbalah, halacha, and zrika. So when we're saying he did lishma and shalei lishma, was that in one avodah, in the shchita alein, or was it in two avodas, in let's say the shchita and let's say the kabbalah? So the Gemara explains what the question is. Now we talking about that it was in one avodah, and in that same avodah he had in mind lishma and shalei lishma, and even so, we're saying that it's going to be invalid. And then we have to say Rabbi Yossi, that it's going like Rabbi Yossi that he says in the Setis Tumor Daf Chafei and Aleph Af B'Gmar Dvar. Also, at the conclusion of a person's words, other mitzvahs a person is going to be defined by. So, and we'll explain shortly. Let's say the case we're talking about is lishmai and shalei lishmai. So even though your first machshav when you started doing this one avodah was stiyas lishma, I'm doing it for the korban Pesach. And then it's halfway through you change your mind, say, nah, I'm doing it shalei lishma. If you're going to say it's possible in the Mishnah, must be that not only the first thing you say is primary, but even the end of what you say is primary. As the Gemara says, because the Meir, everything would be going like a Meir. Ha'amar, he says, Tafas Lashon Rishon, you chap, you grab, you define based on the first thing that he says. This is also where they Masechtas tomorrow, where the case is discussing, if someone says, you see this animal? This animal, I want it to be a Temuras Ayla, Temuras Shlamim. I want it to be the transfer of an Ayla and a Shlamim. Now, it can't be both an Ayla and a Shlamim, so which one is it? So Renee says it's going to be Temuras Ayla, because the first thing you said is what defines it. Rabbi Yossi says, no, what he said is actually valid. It actually has to graze until it develops a blemish, then it's sold, and then you bring half of its money for an Ayla, half of it for a Shlamim. But one thing we see is that according to a Meir, he says the first thing you said and had in mind is what defines it. So then, if you would hold like a Meir, and you talk about an avodah achas, a one avodah, and I had in mind lishma, the fact that I have shalei lishma afterwards is not significant. It wouldn't invalidate it because you go based on the first thing that I said that I had in mind. So if you're saying it's a one avodah, yeah, it says like a busy. But as you continue to Samach Med Aleph, maybe not b'shtei avodas none. Maybe our Mishnah is talking about in two different avodas. In one of them he had in mind lishma. In the other one he had in mind shalei lishma. Oh, then not filler a Meir. Then you could even say our Mishnah is like a Meir. Don't tell us Lashon Rishon that he says you go based on the first thing that he says. Here you can't say Tafas Lashon Rishon. Why? Because really, when would we say that b'avodah achas in one avodah? But by two different avodas, initially he would agree that it's going to be invalid because all these four avodas are all distinguished that you could invalidate the korban by any one of them. So even the korban would be impossible because the fact that by the shchit you had in mind lishma that has nothing to do with the kabbalah or the halacha that you have in mind shalei lishma. that would invalidate. Each one is a avodah that could be invalidated with. Tafas Lashon Rishon would only be in one entity. Here, each avodah is a separate entity. So therefore, then the Mishnah could even be like Rameir. So that was Rav Papa's question. Who is the Mishnah going like, essentially? Is the case by avodah achas or by shtei avodas? So Amri, they first said, to clarify which one of these two versions of the Sefer, the Mishnah, was this question going like? Because there was two cases. There was if you do it l'shmai and shalei l'shmai. There was the inverse, if you do l'shmai, shalei l'shmai and l'shmai. So which one of those two cases was it going on? Zigmar explains. If you say ashalei l'shmai, that first you had in mind, nah, I'm not going to do it for the carbon pass. I'm doing it for some other carbon. And then l'shmai, and then he has in mind for it being l'shmai. Says the Gemara, that would be an obvious. Bein b'avodah achas, bein b'shtei avodas, whether it's one avodah or two different avodas, that would be like everyone. Bein Rameya, whether according to Rameya that by one avodah he would say it's going to be possible because he said Tafas Lashon Rishon. Bein Rabbi Yasi, whether going like Rabbi Yasi, if Salei Mikamaisa, it would already be invalidated by the first one. The whole Rabbi Yasi now, because even according to Rabbi Yasi, it's not that he holds you go based on the end and not the beginning. He holds that even the last thing that you say, in other words, it's the beginning and the end, but all of them is what you get defined by, and all of it has to be fulfilled. So everyone would agree if the first machshava you had in mind was shaloi l'shma and then l'shma, that it could even be like Rameir, because it wouldn't make a difference. One avodah, two avodas. If Rameir says Tavas Lashon Rishon, obviously that's going to be possible. Ella, rather the question, if we're saying the Mishnah is only basically not like Rameir, would be al l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai. If you first because if you talk about one avodah and the Mishnah is saying it's going to be possible, then you can't say it's like Rameir anymore, because he says Tavas Lashon Rishon. And that means to say the second thing that you had in mind is not going to take effect. The first thing you had in mind was l'shmai, and then shaloi l'shmai. So then it wouldn't take effect. Man, that's the question. Are we talking about one avodah or two avodas? That was our public question. We know what he's asking. So now the Gemara attempts 4 different proofs to try to prove what's the case of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah opened up. This was what's called the ratio of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Pesach Shashach, it's a little, today's daf is very technical in the rayas, so just if you're that type, get excited. If you're not, hold on. Pesach Shashach Shaloi L'shmai. The carbon Pesach that was slaughtered, Shaloi L'shma, I'll say L'shma, I say in the feminine, because that's usually, but Shaloi L'shma, not for its namesake, because the carbon Pesach is a Zachar, so saying Shaloi L'shma. V'kibel v'halach v'zark Shaloi L'shma, and you did the Kabbalah, you did the Halacha, you did the Zrik, you did the Shaloi L'shma. Says Gemara, wait a second. How do you read this opening case in the Mishnah? If you think it's like the words sound like, where you did the Shechita, and the Kabbalah, and the Halacha, and the Zrika, and all of them were Shaloi L'shma, not or. It sounds like if you read it, that they were all done Shaloi L'shma. Says the Gemara, wait a second. Why would I need to have a Shaloi L'shma on all of them? Already from the first of it, it already became invalidated because the Halacha is, the Gemara says in the first two Gemara Zvachim that by any one of these 4 avodas you can invalidate a carbon by having a machshava psula. Elolav, there's a lot of these spars, what's called spars, a lot of these on today's daf. Mezayin. So elolav rather hachigtani. So this is what the Mishnah was really saying. Not all of them. Pesach shashach shaloi l'shmai. If the carbon was slaughtered not for its namesake, or inami shach l'shmai, or even if it was slaughtered l'shma. And then you did the Kabbalah, or the Halach, or the Zviki. If you did it Shaloi L'shma, or Inami. It's saying the same thing basically, that but you did Shechita and the Kabbalah, and you did it the Halach L'shma, but V'zark Shaloi L'shma, you did the Zvika Shaloi L'shma. Essentially what it's trying to say, it's like saying or. The Havila Shtei Avodas, which that, if you read the Mishnah, when you're telling me the case of doing the Shechita appropriately, Kabbalah, let's say appropriately, Halacha appropriately, and then Zrika Shaloi L'shma, essentially the case of the Mishnah, if in those wordings we're talking about 2 different avodas, because you're telling me, you're mentioning all the 4 avodas, but you're telling me you only had Shaloi L'shma one of the avodas. So essentially you're telling me a case of L'shma, V'shaloi L'shma, in 2 different avodas, not in the same avodah itself. So that was the ratio of the Mishnah. Now let's look at the case we're discussing here in the Sefer of the Mishnah. The Mishnah then says, L'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai, if you have in mind for l'shma and then shaloi l'shma, it's going to be possible. Hey, chedami, what's the case talking about? If you think it's by 2 different avodas, where you did it by, let's say, the shechita l'shma, and you did it by the Kabbalah shaloi l'shma, Hainu Reisha. It's the same thing as the Reisha, which is Lishma one, Shalishma the other one. What are you saying again? The same words that you just said before. Rather, isn't it obvious? We're not saying in two different words. Saying in one avodah, you're having Lishma and Shalishma anytime it's possible. Rabisi, so the Mishnah has to be going like Rabisi. The Amad that he says, yeah, although you first said Lishma, but you also get defined based on the last thing that you said. If not, the first thing you said was good, but then the second thing, that's it. Not like Meir. Meir says, yeah, if the first thing I had in mind was good, then this avoid is good. Must be, you see, says the Gemara, that our Mishnah is going like a beast. Says the Gemara, no. La'olam, the truth is, the Seifa also that says L'shmai v'shalei L'shmai is b'shtei avodas, is by two different avodas. But then the question was, wait a second, that's the same thing you said in the Reisha. Says the Gemara, no, it's not difficult. You know why? The Reisha, the koi b'shrita, become a chashiv b'shrita. You know what the case of the Reisha was talking about? You were doing the avodah by the shechita, and you had in mind about the shechita. Or inami, let's say koi bezrika, become a chashav bezrika. You were doing the zrika, and you had in mind on the zrika itself. So when you were doing the shechita, you had in mind lishma. But when you did the zrika, you had in mind shalai lishma. That's what the case was talking about b'shtei avodas, where you had lishma b'shalai lishma by two different avodas. Now seifa is also b'shtei avodas, but it's a bigger chiddush, and that's why it's not redundant. The koi b'shchita, the kachashiv b'zrika. At the time of you doing the shchita, you're having two machshavas, two thoughts. One on the shchita itself, lishma. But then, you know what I'm going to do this zrika for some other carbon. The Amad that he says, I'm going to slow the carbon that I'm doing right now for its namesake. Lizroik dami shalei lishmai. With the intention that when I'm going to throw it, I'm going to do it not for its namesake. Here you can't say Tavas Lashon Rishon, because this is going on a different Aveda. And Rabbi would agree that it would be considered puzzle. The Kamash Molan, and that's the Chiddush I'm coming to tell you. But I mean, you already spoke about to avoid this in the Reisha. No, it's a different case. It's another Chiddush. The Mechashim Avoid Avoida. That you could have in mind when you're doing this Avoida on a different Avoida, to do it with a Machshava Absul, that it immediately becomes possible, even if you don't even end up doing the second Machshava with a Machshava Absul. Just having that in mind that you want to do that is going to invalidate itself. Which behind your bayit Papa, two different interpretation what that means. Taisa says that that's what is actually what Rav Papa over here is asking, but Rashi says that this refers to this that we're saying that you could have in mind from one avodah to another avodah is what Rav Papa asks in Masechtas Zvachim in the first part of Yudam and Aleph, where the Gemara says over there that maskim Rav Papa that maybe the chiddush is mechash avodah avodah. It's a different sugya over there, but basically that's what Rav Papa asks somewhere else. How do you know? Maybe it means that you're doing it from one avodah to another avodah. But one thing is, you could still say al kaponim that our Mishnah could be like Meir. Why? Isn't it obvious we're talking about one avodah? No, it's talking about two different avodah. Two avodas you mentioned already in the Reisha, where if you were doing the shkita okay and Kabbalah not okay, that's lishma v'shalei lishma. How could you repeat again lishma v'shalei lishma? No, it's not the same case, because you were doing it in the same avodah itself. I'm having lishma for the shkita al manas to do the zrika shalei lishma. Oh, that's a big chiddush that you didn't say in the Reisha, and that we're saying that's still going to be possible, and that could be like a Meir too, because that's not a Tavas Lashon Rishon. It's a separate avodah. A separate avodah, like we said, doesn't have the Tavas Lashon Rishon, and therefore it could even be like a Meir, the halacha of the Mishnah. It's not a raya that's tumah b'avodah achas. That was raya number one. Then we go on to raya number two. Tashema. We said in the Mishnah, in the Seifa, when we talked about, where we mentioned Lishma and Shalei Lishma, we mentioned two cases. First, the Mishnah said, Oy Shalei Lishmai v'Lishmai. We said that, or if you're going to do it, Shalei, we said first that you knew Lishma and Shalei Lishma, which we're going to mention in a moment. And then it said, Oy Shalei Lishmai Lishmai, which is the case we're discussing, which we're not discussing. That's the other case. Shalei Lishma v'Lishmai possible. The Mishnah mentions, or if you do it not for its namesake and its namesake, it's going to be possible. Says what's this case of the Mishnah talking about? Which is right after the case that we're discussing, that we want to know when you do Lishmai, the Shalei Lishmai, if you want to avoid the 12 avodas, the next case right after that is, or if you do Shalei Lishmai, Lishmai, it's going to be possible. So, Heichadam. If you think that this case is talking about by two different avodas, which let's say I do the Shchita, Shalei Lishmai, I do the Zrika, Lishmai. Hashta, if you're telling me right before this, you just told me Lishmai, Shalei Lishmai. That when it's done for its namesake and not for its namesake. Where the first avodah that you're doing is valid if you're telling me it's two different avodas. Amid possibly, you tell me it's going to be possible because you had a machshava by the second avodah. Do I have to tell you the next case that if you do the first one Shaloi L'Shmai and the second one L'Shmai, that what I mean, that's going to be possible? Of course, it already became invalidated by the first Avodah. Where it's going to come revalidated when you do the second Avodah L'Shma. How can you say that's about two different Avodas? If it's two different Avodas, you just told me the sentence before. You told me if you do the first one L'Shma, second one L'Shma, it's going to be possible. Okay, and you did the first Avodah good. Okay, you were going, you were on the right track. Second Avodah L'Shma, it's going to be possible. But then how can you tell me the next case? If you do it Shaloi L'Shma L'Shma, it's Eichid possible. The first Avodah, you already did Shaloi L'Shma. Second Avodah is not going to revalidate it, you already did it possible. Elolav, rather obviously, it's talking about Avodah Achas. It's talking about one Avodah. Okay, so what? Now you can understand the Chiddush of the Mishnah. Because we're coming to tell you when you do it L'Shmai, V'Shaloi L'Shmai, which is the first case, that's going to be possible, that's coming to exclude from Rebbeir. That he says Tapus Lashon Rishon. According to him, it would be kosher when you do one Avodah, L'Shmai, V'Shaloi L'Shmai. Now, and then why do you have to say, Rashi addresses essentially what would you have to explain to the Gemara, then why would you say Shaloi L'Shmai L'Shma? What's that? That's still not a Chiddush. Why is that asked only on Shtei Avodas? And one Avodah also, if you told me L'Shma, Shaloi L'Shma is possible. For Shaloi L'Shma L'Shma, no. The Chiddush is, they don't say Tafis Lashon Achrei. Don't say that you're going to define based on the end of what you do, because you could entertain to say that you're obviously retracting from what you originally said. So when you shechted, it's actually based on the last machshava that you had, and you would have thought to say that when you do l'shmai, shalom l'shmai l'shma, it actually would be kosher. That's what the chiddush is. That no, it's going like a BC that he holds big marrow, but it doesn't mean only. It means you're based on everything that you say, and you didn't retract, and you had it in mind for both of them, and therefore it's going to be possible. So it would make sense the Mishnah if you were telling me that it's talking about avodah achat. Oh, okay, so with the sefer, for the fact that the second case of Shaloi L'Shma L'Shma is by avodah achas by one avodah, because like we said, by two avodas you wouldn't need it, because obviously you would know from the case of L'Shma for Shaloi L'Shma, for sure, Shaloi L'Shma L'Shma would be problematic with two different avodas. Okay, so then Reish is in the first case of L'Shma for Shaloi L'Shma, not by avodah achas, then it's also by one avodah. It should be, if you're saying it's by one avodah, and doing the Shema, the Shalom, it's going to be possible. Must be like a risk, because according to Meir, one avodah would be kosher. Says Gemara, no, not a right. The truth is, it's talking about two different avodas. But then you ask, wait a second. So then, obviously, for the second case, it already became invalidated from the first time that you did Shalom, Shema. If you did this, if you talk about two different avodas, and you say, okay, so then the case of the Shema, the Shalom, could be like a Meir too. But then, how do you understand the next line? The next line is, Shalom, Shema is also going to be possible. Of course, two different avodas. You already did one whole avodah apostle. Why would you say that? Says the Gemara, no, within a delay, you're right. Really, the next case is unnecessary. Now, I need to talk about the Shema, but the Shalom, it's only because we said the case of when you do the first one Lishma, the second one Shalom, which we're coming to tell you, a Chiddush. What's the Chiddush? As we said from the first Raya of the Gemara. This case of Lishma, the Shalom, is that you actually, it's not two different avodas, it's two different avodas, but from avodah to avodah. Like we explained, that you're having in mind when you're doing the shechita, that the shechita should be lishma, al manas, that the zrika should be shaloi lishma. So it's two different avodas, but it's a chiddush in that case, which even Rameh would agree to. So tadanami shaloi lishma lishma. So therefore, once we said that, we said the opposite, we said the inverse, only for symmetrical purposes. You're right, it doesn't really need any chiddush b'chlal. Of course, if you're doing the first avodah lishma and the second one shaloi lishma, it's going to be possible. For sure, if the first one shaloi lishma and the second one lishma, for sure it's going to be possible. You're right, and it's not a raya that's talking about babadachas. It's an unnecessary chiddush, but we said it because of, we said one way, so we said the other way too. But not a raya that's tumat by one of it. Now then, Gemara goes on to the next two rayas, which are both from the following Mishnah on the next daf. Tasha Matzving a raya from the next Mishnah. It says, we're continuing on this theme about psul machshavas when you're doing, or avodas in the Korban Pesach. So the Mishnah says, Shachtei shaloi la'ochel. If someone slaughtered the Korban Pesach, not for those who can eat the Korban Pesach, let's say for a sick person or elderly person who cannot even the kazayis of the Korban Pesach, and there's no one else that's listed on the Korban Pesach but them, that's going to make a possible Korban Pesach, because the pasuk says ish lefi achlei. Ish lefi achlei means to say that the Korban Pesach can only be slaughtered for those who are fit to eat. If the people that you're slaughtering it for are shalei la'ichlav, it's going to be invalid. Or let's say slaughters it for shalei l'nuyev, not for those who are counted. The halacha is that a Korban Pesach you have to have already been counted on it before it. But the problem is there was one chevra that was counted on it, and he slaughters it for a different chabura. Well, let's allow Elam. let's say slaughtered the Korban Pesach for a Yisrael who his brothers died because of circumcision. Now, although he can't do the Bris Milah because of safety, but he's still invalidated from eating the Korban Pesach, like it says, Kal Ara Lo Yachal, by anyone who's uncircumcised, cannot eat from it. So it's not valid to slaughter it for Arela. Or the Tameim. Let's say slaughtering it for someone who's Tamei, or also forbidden to partake of Kachim, and this chorus if such a person would eat it. So any one of these types of shechita, if you slaughter it for any one of these types of categories of people, Pasal is going to be invalid. Now, says the Gemara, Hacham Pshita, here there's no doubt, here it's obvious, Avodah Achas. Obviously the next Mishnah is talking about that you're doing in one Avodah because there's only one machshava that you're having. It's for the Arelim, it's for whoever it is. So it's in one Avodah that we're saying would invalidate it. So says the Gemara, when the Sefer of Avodah Achas, and the fact that quote unquote the Sefer, the next Mishnah, a lot of times the Gemara calls it Sefer Reisha because the Mishnah was broken down into smaller parts, and we had Gemara Talmudic discussions on that, but it's really part of our Mishnah. So the fact that the Sefer is coming by one Avodah, so Reisha Nam Avodah Achas, and the Reisha is also by one Avodah. In other words, even by one Avodah, and that is not like Remeir, because according to Remeir, you see Tavas Lashon Rishon would be kosher. Obviously, you see that our Mishnah is even Avodah Achas, which would be only like Rabbi Yasi, where Bigmar Dvar Ma'atim Nekmas, and if you had Lishmai, Shalai Lishmai, it's going to be possible like Rabbi Yasi. Says the Gemara, no, Midi, Iriya. Is this a proof? Hakadisa, Hakadisa. No, each one is talking about its distinct case. Seifa, meaning the next Mishnah, is talking about, like we said, one machshava, because you can only explain it where it's Avodah Achas, it's by one Avodah, because it's just one machshava. Reisha, but our Mishnah was talking about two different machshavas. So then you could explain that Iba Avodah Achas, it could be even, let's say, it could be by one Avodah and not like there. But you could explain by talking about two different Avodas and not one Avodah, and there would even be like a mayor, but it's not a Raya. That could be its own case, and our Mishnah could be its own case. You must have touched on another Raya, a similar type of Raya from that next Mishnah. Mishnah says, Lo'eichlav b'shaloi lo'eichlav. Let's say someone was slaughtering the Korban Pesach for those that could eat, and for those that can't eat it. As we're going to explain shortly what that means. So kasha, it's going to be valid then. If you did it only for shaloi lo'eichlav, we say it's not going to be kasha. If you did it for people that could eat and people that can't eat, then it's going to be valid. It says, what's the case talking about? If you think that we're talking about that it's by two different avodas, in other words, when you do the shechita, okay, I'm going to do it for those who could eat it. But I'm doing it with the intention that when I'm going to do the zrika, it's going to be for those who cannot eat it. And that the Mishnah is coming to tell you that's going to be kosher. Now, but time, what would be the reason that would be kosher? Because the chashav is zrika, because it's a lot of cheshbon over here by all these cases, but when I'm doing the machshava, I had two machshavas on two different avodas. One regarding the shechita, one regarding the zrika. The machshava I had on the shechita was for those who could eat it, so that's good. Machshava I had that I'm having in mind when we do the zrika, and we do it for those who can't eat it, that was the one that was not good. But it's a different avodah on that zrika. So why would it be kosher? Because you're having in mind a machshava of shaloi lo'eichlav on the zrika. And says the Gemara, the ein machshava is eichel mezrika. There is no machshava of psul on the halacha on the avodah of zrika. You cannot have a machshava of invalidating it because of the eaters, like a person who's sick or elderly, to invalidate the zrika, because it's only by the shechita that it mentions that you have to have eaters, because it says lafi achle techusu, which the word techusu means to slaughter, like the Aramaic translation of the shachat is v'yikar. So the reason why it's going to be kosher is because your machshava on the zrika of eichlin is not an invalidated machshava. That can only be on the shechita and on the zrika. But it says, okay, so wait a second. So then if it was by one avodah, what are you trying to tell me? Let's say I did it only in the shechita. Then you're telling me that having in mind for those who cannot eat it, the machshava of doing it for them when they can puzzle, then it would be puzzle, even in such a case where a person said that it should be la'oichlav, v'shaloi la'oichlav. You can't say that. Because what Kaim Alon, the Gemara tells us later on the next Daf, Samach Aleph and Aleph, that makes us oichlin. For example, like over here, when you counted for those you're doing the Korban Pesach, for those who could eat, and for those who cannot eat. And now you're slaughtering it for all of them. In mind, the halach is loy pasla, it's not invalidated. Why isn't it invalidated? Because the whole shechita is necessary for the eaters, for the partial eaters. Because you can't have even an olive size of meat of an animal without shechting it. And later on the Gemara is going to explain, so wait a second, why is it any different when you do l'shmoi b'shalei l'shmoi, that's possible, and why la'eichlav b'shalei la'eichlav, it's going to be kosher. But one thing is we see that when you do l'miktzas eichlav, We can do it even if there are 100 people on that you're doing the Korban Pesach for, and only 20 could eat. Mixes Eichlin is going to be valid. So the Gemara says like this. The case of this is again a lot of cheshbon just to come back to try to prove what our Mishnah's case is talking about. The next Mishnah, where it discusses la'ichlav b'shlei la'ichlav, if you have in mind for 10 people could eat and 10 people can't eat, you tell me that it's kosher. Now what's that case talking? If you think to tell me that it's b'shtei avodas, and why is it kosher, is because the la'ichlav, when they did the shechita of, is but for the shechita, but that's okay. Then the other machshava of the loy la'ichlav was I had in mind that this zri could be for the shlei la'ichlav. It's not going to be invalid. The reason why it's kosher is because the halach of shlei la'ichlav is only invalidated by the shechita, not by the zrika. Okay, that would make sense. I can understand why you would try to say the case from b'shtei avodas. But then, what's the diuk? The inference is, but if it was b'avoda achas, then it wouldn't be kosher. Then it would be puzzle. But that's not true either. Because if you're doing the shechita la'ichlav b'shaloi la'ichlav, which is called miktzah eichlin, it's kosher. So what are you telling me the case is talking about b'shtei avodas? It can't be. It's even be avoda achas. So as we continue with Beis, the Labra says the Gemara avoda achas. Obviously, that it's even. Not only that it's even by one avoda of the shechita, it's going to be kosher. And the Mishnah is telling you whether if you do it by one avoda or two avodas. In other words, if you do it by one avoda like the shechita, it's going to be kosher for two different reasons. If you do by avoda achas, it's going to be kosher because of what we said miktzas eichlin. Partial eaters is not invalidated. And when you do it by two different avodas, let's say you do the shechita for those who could eat it and the zrika for those who cannot eat it, even though the whole zrika is shalei la'ichlav, it's also going to be kosher because of a different reason. Because you don't have machshavas ha'ichlav by zrika. But one thing is that we see, says the Gemara, in the sefer avoda achas, and the fact that the sefer, meaning the next Mishnah, is talking about even by one avoda, so reisha nami, then what we're calling the reisha, our Mishnah too, which is by lishmai v'shalei lishmai, that's going to be possible, is also avoda achas. It's also going to be even by the case of avoda achas. Why? How is that possible? Because af bigmar dvarav adam nitfas, which is like Rabbi Yasi, because although the first machshava he had was lishma, but the second one should be lishma, and if you see it's not like Rabbi Meir, you see that the halacha Mishnah is even by avoda achas, like you see from the next Mishnah. The Gemara says here, like it said in the first raya, vidiri is it a raya? Hakadisa, no, both are talking about whatever their cases are. Save avoda achas, you're the save is even by one avoda. But Veresha, I would tell you, even if it's by one avodah, and you're right, then it would be like a basi. Or maybe it would even be by two avodah, and not by one avodah, which would even be like a mayor, because it would be by one avodah. I actually would tell you that's going to be kosher, because when you're l'shmai, v'shalei l'shmai, tafas l'sharisha, you go based on the first thing that he had in mind, which was for that of l'shma, and therefore the Gemara does not resolve the question that we had started off with regarding who is the time of the Mishnah. What's the case of the Mishnah Torah when we do the Shema v'Shalei Shema? All the four rayas were inconclusive to prove what's the case of our Mishnah. Now, with that, we move on to a related discussion to the halacha of our Mishnah. We were discussing up until now regarding on Erev Pesach when you do it Lishma and Shalei Lishma. Now we're going to discuss, because the interesting thing is that we said during the year a Korban Pesach is actually brought as a Shlach. And if you do it L'Shem Pesach, it's actually going to be puzzle. In other words, what's inverse is that the rest of the year, Shaloi L'Shma is actually kosher, and L'Shma is puzzle. Because the Korban Pesach, any other day of the year, is a Shlama. So if you do it L'Shma, you're doing it for Korban Pesach, and you're actually doing it wrong. If you do it Shaloi L'Shma, which is for the Shlama, it's actually doing it right. So that's where it brings us to the following discussion. It's also a very cheshbon question. Pesach shashach b'shayim eisasham. A Korban Pesach that you slaughtered any other day of the year. So, for example, like Rashi says, you already designated your Korban Pesach way before Pesach. You're one of these people. You already cleaned the Pesach now already. No Chanukah ma'ayib shanun, but the Pesach cleaning ready. You already designated his Korban Pesach, and the halacha is that it's kosher as a shlamim, as the Gemara says later on, Daf Ayin on the base. Now, if he slaughters it for it to be a Korban Pesach, it's going to be puzzle because actually it's not the time for a Korban Pesach. If he slaughters it as a shlamim, it's going to be kosher. Now, this is the Gemara's question. What's if he slaughters it on any other day of the year? L'shmai, v'shaloi l'shmai, ma. He does it to be a Korban Pesach, and not to be a Korban Pesach, a shlamim, on any other day of the year. What's the halacha? So the Gemara explains the question. Mi asi shaloi l'shmai. Do we say the subsequent shaloi l'shmai, which is, let's say, to make it into a shlamim, that comes umapik lemidei l'shmai, that removes it from being l'shma, which is a Korban Pesach, and therefore umachshule, that validates it, like a shlamim, which is really a shlamim. I love it, or maybe not. Once we already did it lishma, which is problematic, because it's not a Pesach on any other day of the year, that's already going to make it problematic, and it's not going to be fixed by the subsequent machshava of shalosh. So says the Gemara, Ki Asr Abdimi Amud, when Abdimi came along, he said that, he said, I said this teaching in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah to learn out from a logical opinion of, to say that it's going to be possible. Why does he say it's going to be possible? This is like this, and this is what it relates to halacha of our Mishnah. Hayil v'lishmai machshir bizmanoi. When you do a Korban Pesach, lishmai, for its namesake, as a Korban Pesach, on its appropriate time, on Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan, doing it lishma validates it. Vishalei lishmai machshir shalei bizmanoi. And when you do it not for its namesake, which is the shlamim, that also validates it any other day of the year. So essentially, it's comparing Pesach on the 14th, or shlamim on any other day of the year. I mean, this animal, it's really Korban Pesach, it's the same thing as it is on Erev Pesach for its namesake, as Shalol Lishma on any other day of the year, which is what validates. Now, so therefore, let's compare it to the halacha of our Mishnah. Ma lishma yamachshir bizmani. If you find that when you do it lishma, which is makes it valid on the 4th of Nisan, ein maitziyeh midei shalei lishma, that does not remove it from the original kavana of shalei lishma, to say that you're only going to go based on the last thing that you had in mind, and to validate if it was slaughtered shalei lishma v'lishma. And we said in our Mishnah, if you go on Erev Pesach, on the day when you bring the Korban Pesach, you have in mind shalei lishma v'lishma. Is it going to be kosher? No, Mishnah said clearly it's going to be possible, because the subsequent machshava of lishma is not going to remove it from the shalei lishma. So he says, af shalei lishma hamachshir shalei bizman. So the same thing is shalei lishma on any other day of the year, which that validates it then. That cannot remove it from lishmai to say you should go based on the second thing you're saying to validate it, and therefore it's may possible. Essentially, it's the same thing if you're following the logic. The word shalei lishmai just might mislead you. Shalei lishmai basically means say it's being made for a shlam, and any other day of the year this animal is a shlam, and making it quote lishmai, which is for a Korban Pesach, is the problem machshav. So if Erev Pesach doing it shalei lishmai and then lishma is not going to be kosher. So every other day of the year, doing it l'shmai v'shalei l'shma, which is the same mechanics, is also not going to make it kosher. That was his right. V'amalin, he said to the Lord, no, it's not a right. You know why? If you're going to say, b'shalei l'shmai, when you're doing it on the 14th of Nisan, and it's a psul when you do it shalei l'shmai, you know why that's not going to be removed when you subsequently have the machshava of l'shma? Shekei noyig, because that invalidation applies b'chal hazvachim, by all karbanis. When you do a korban shalei lishma, whether it totally invalidates it, like a korban pesach alachatas, or at least invalidates it from fulfilling the obligation of the owner, as it is by all other karbanis, like the opening Mishnah Masechet Zevachim teaches, any korban that's slaughtered shalei lishma, you're right, it's going to be kosher, that you can throw the blood, you can burn the imur, you can eat the meat, but it's not going to fulfill the owner's obligation, except for korban pesach alachatas, which is even worse, that is totally invalid. But one thing is that we see that the psul, the invalidation of shalei lishma, applies across the board by every korban. So therefore, a subsequent machshava of lishma cannot come and remove it from that psul of shalei lishma, because it's a gezinte psul. Every korban has the psul of shalei lishma. So regarding your korban pesach and Erev Pesach, you went and did it shalei lishma and then lishma, you can't remove it. It's already had a bona fide invalidation. But that's only by Erev Pesach, where the problem was shalei lishma and then lishma. But listen up. But Toimra, are you going to say regarding the psul of bilishmai, something so ironic, is that you have a korban pesach. Any other day of the year, when you do it lishma, you would think, okay, chavigatim lishma, that's actually a psul. So are you going to say the psul of lishma, which is any other day of the year? You don't have any korban doing it lishma, that's going to be a problem.
When you say shaloi lishmo, I intend for that not to be a shlom, not to be a korban?
No, not to be this korban. This Pesach, I'm doing it not to be a Pesach.
So shaloi lishmo is not somebody that's just not thinking at all.
No.
Because not thinking at all,
right.
What would be
Stam lishma, right?
It's stam lishma.
Right, we're saying you're having in mind that it should not be this thing. Now, what's interesting is that by the Korban Pesach, there's a psul called lishma. How do you have a psul of lishma? Because the Pesach, any other day of the year, is not a Pesach. It's a shlama. And if you bring it Korban Pesach, and you're not allowed to bring it, but that afternoon of Erev Pesach, if you bring it any other time, it's actually possible. So if you're having in mind to do it as a Pesach on, let's say, the 12th of Nisan, that's a machshav psul, because it's not a valid Korban Pesach. It's actually a valid Shlom, but it is a Pesach. So if you do it Lishma, that psul only applies by the Korban Pesach on any other day of the year. So as Rashi explains, since it's a more lenient invalidation because it's only applicable by the Korban Pesach, so maybe I would tell you that Shaloi Lishma, which is really making it for Shlamim, would remove it from the psul of Lishma, because that's a very unique psul of only by the Korban Pesach. So therefore, it's not a raya. He wanted to prove this case of doing it on any other day of the year, that you're first doing a Lishma, B'Shaloi Lishma, that okay, of course, it's going to be puzzle. And you could learn it out from its equivalent on their Pesach of doing it Shaloi Lishma B'Lishma. Then Lishma doesn't remove it. Here the Shaloi Lishma should not remove it from the Lishma. No, it's not the same thing. Because here the psul of Lishma is a winziger psul. It's a small. It's not such a universal psul. And maybe the kashrus of Shaloi Lishma would remove it from the psul of Lishma. So says Gemara. So my habit. So what is the conclusion regarding this question? Samar Rabba, he actually says Pesach sheshachti b'shayim seshan. So if you slaughter Korban Pesach on any other day of the year, Lishmai v'Shaloi Lishmai, which again Lishmai is the problem machshava, and then you do subsequently Shaloi Lishmai. He actually says not like the first interpretation. He says kasher, it's going to be kasher. And again, he comes up with his own svara, and we're going to discuss that svara. Says Gemara, he says like, I'll prove to you why. Because the stamai lishmai kar, take a Korban Pesach, as any carbon, we presume it's being done for its namesake. So if you slaughter Korban Pesach on any day of the year, the 10th of Nisan, the 5th of Nisan, if you're going to do it, we're presuming that you're doing it to be a Korban Pesach.
No.
We're presuming, no, because it...
Only at a Pesach.
No, what is the carbon? What is the animal? It's a Korban Pesach. When you're bringing it, we always assume stama lishma. You're doing it for what? Anytime you come to shiur, when you're doing something, the Mishnah Berurah says the reason why you yoitz a lot of mitzvahs is because stama you're doing it because even though you're not having in mind, you're supposed to have machshava when you say krishma. So why are you coming to shul for? Why are you putting on tzitzis? Why are you doing it all? Because they're a bunch of so that's why you do it. So when you're doing a carbon, we presume you're doing it for what the carbon itself is. If you want to have in mind something else, you could, and that's actually what validated it. But we presume that you're doing it for its namesake as a Korban Pesach. And even so, when you actually go, like you're saying, when he goes and he slaughters on the 10th of Nisan or the 5th of Nisan and he does it Shaloi Lishmai, which is really for Shlamim, kasher is going to be kasher. So you see, Asi Shaloi Lishmai, interesting to listen to the logic. You see that Shaloi Lishmai comes, Umapik Lemidei Lishmai. It's removing from the Lishmai. You have the logic? He's trying to say, we presume that you're doing it Lishma. But your subsequent Shaloi Lishma, which... What?
He holds Tvois Lashon Achron.
If he holds Tavos Lashon Achron, it's not so much Tavos Lashon Achron. There is no Lashon Achron. You're trying to say that the Gemara is
caused the psul already.
Why the red?
Because the Lashon Rishon caused the psul already. So why can't we say twice Lashon Achron?
And that really goes into the discussion of the halacha of our Mishnah regarding if we're saying that it's like Rabbi Yisi. Right. So let's see what the logic that he's saying is. That he's saying that if you take Shaloi Lishma, what happens is when you're having this stama machshava, which you're not really having any machshava, you're subsequently machshava of Shaloi Lishma comes, umapik lebedei Lishma removes it from Lishma. So that's what I'm saying. There's no Tavos Lashon Lishma. Didn't have any machshava in mind. So and you see that's going to validate it. So kishachet nami lishmai. So when you slaughter it lishmai, vishalai lishmai, and then subsequently you have in mind shalai lishmai, asi shalai lishmai, umapikli midei lishmai. So then he's saying that even when you have in mind lishmai, the subsequent shalai lishmai you remove from lishmai, just like you're going to say by stama lishma. So he says that should be the same thing when even if you have that explicitly, that it should be validated. To which Amalei Rabbi says no. Maybe it's different where you actually said it, where you didn't say it. In other words, that even though where the person did not originally say lishmai, but it was just stama lishmai, and he said shalai lishmai is going to be kosher, but maybe when you say lishmai and then shalai lishmai, maybe that's going to be possible. Whatever the toughest, the lashon is, but it's not a raya from that halacha. And actually, the questioner who's rejecting the interpretation proves his point. That there's a difference between when you say it or when you're just presuming it. Why? Because the hala'ichlav shalei leichlav kasher regarding if someone says he's going to slaughter the korban pesach for those who could eat it and those who can't eat it. So the next mission is going to tell us it's going to be kasher. Now, if you slaughter it only shalei leichlav, it's mamash a cheshbon over here. It's going to be puzzle. Now, v'mai, why is it going to be puzzle? You presume that when you slaughter korban pesach, you're presuming you're doing it for those who could eat it. And still you see that when he has in mind shalei leichlav, it's going to remove it from its stamei, and it's going to make it puzzle. Whereas, if let's say he first said leichlav, and then he said shalei leichlav, the shalei leichlav are not going to remove it from the leichlav. It's going to be kosher, like we said, mixes leichlav is going to be kosher. So, ella shani heichadama. Obviously, there's a difference between when you actually say it leichlav, mechad where you don't say it. Just the stomach is not going to be enough to go ahead and make it into a mixes leichlav. In other words, you're going to say the shalei leichlav will remove it from the stomach. Asachanam here also. Shani heichadama. It's different where he says the shmoi first, mechad where he doesn't say. And then it's going to become puzzle. So he's rejecting Rav's interpretation by proving his point that there is a difference between when you say it and when it's just a stomach. Because Rav's whole logic was from stomach. You see by stomach lishma, the shalai lishma is going to remove it. Seriously, when you say lishma, the shalai lishma should remove it. Now Rav says no. Midiria, is it a raya? In other words, can you compare the stomach of la'eichlam to the stomach of lishma that you should learn that one from the other? No. Why not? We understand over there by Stama Lishma, that's very strong. Why? Because Kama Delay Akale, as long as you didn't uproot the designation of a title of a Pesach from it, so Bishchita, when you're slaughtering it, Stame Vad Lishmaika, we definitely presume it's going to be done for what it is, which is a Korban Pesach. And even so, when he says Shalai Lishma is going to remove it from its Stame, from its presumed status, so therefore, even so, says Rabbi the logic, when you originally say Lishmai, you could also learn out from there that when, the Shalai Lishmai is going to come along and remove it from the Lishmai. Because there is no difference between when you say it and when you don't say it. You're telling me, but over here by La'ichlav, Stama La'ichlav, do you really think that the Stama is for the eaters? In other words, do you think that presumptive state is so strong to say that it's being for the eaters? No, it's very different. Because maybe if the people want to, they could withdraw themselves and they could sell their shares in this Korban Pesach to another chabur, to another group. And then another group is going to come and be counted on it. It's not which the Mishnah later on the Pei Testament out. The halacha is nimnin. Whoever wants to be counted on the Korban Pesach could be counted on the Korban Pesach. Whoever wants to withdraw his shares, even though he was already counted, the halacha is they could withdraw their hand from it. Until it's slaughtered, you could go ahead and remove yourself from this chabura and join a different chabura. So therefore, it's not so strong the stama la'ichlav because it's not really such a stama because the eichlav have rights to remove themselves, and it's not even going to be a stama la'ichlav. So even though the machshava of shalei la'ichlav that there you're saying it's going to remove it from the stama and invalidate it, but that's different when you say la'ichlav in the beginning from when you didn't say it. Because over there, the reason is because that stomach is not so strong. Because you see, it's not such a stomach la'ichlav. Who's la'ichlav? You could join, you could leave, you could join, you could leave. And then you could say that it removes originally, and that the people who were originally the sick people and the elderly people, that it's all going to be slaughtered shalai la'ichlav, because the people that were la'ichlav, maybe they removed themselves from it. So therefore, that's what's going to be possible. And when you say, however, la'ichlav b'shalai la'ichlav, then you have mixed asaychim, so therefore it's not going to be invalidated. But one thing that you see is that's not the same thing. The idea of Rabbi says that no, there's no stama la'ichlav because people withdraw all the time, and therefore it's not going to be right. Therefore, again, Rabbi is a good answer when he says that when the shalei bismami you do it l'shmai b'shalei l'shmai, that's going to be kosher because he says you see by stama l'shma the shalei l'shma removes it and makes it puzzle. So then l'shmai b'shalei l'shma is going to be the same thing. You find by la'ichlav b'shalei l'ichlav you see there's a difference between stama and amar. That's because la'ichlav there's no real strong stama la'ichlav. And therefore, that was Rabbi's approach to say that this case of the Korban Pesach Shalei Bismani is actually going to be subsequently validated by the Machshava of Shalei Bishma. So we discussed in today's Daf Psachim, Daf Samach, where the Papa had a question. The halacha of our Mishnah that said, If you do it Lishma and Shalom Lishma, it's going to be possible. Is that by one Avaida, which the Gemara ultimately explained was talking about that your first Machshava is Lishma, and then Shalom Lishma. And therefore then the Mishnah has to be like Rabbi Yesi, where he says that even Begmar Dvar of Adam Nitfas, which would mean to say, the last words that you say of Shalom Lishma would be significant, or maybe, and it can't be like Rabbi Meir, because according to Meir, this would be the primary of Lishma, which is the Tavas Lashon Rishon, so it would have to be like a basic, or maybe no, maybe it's by two different Avodas too, and it's even like a Meir who says Tavas Lashon Rishon, here when there's two different Avodas, each one is its own Avodah to become invalidated, and he would also agree that's going to be possible. So Gemara attempted 4 rayas inconclusively. First we wanted to bring a raya because the Reisha says it's possible when you do it Shalai Lishma, and that's even if you did Lishma by one of the Avodas before it. So essentially, the Shalai Lishma is by a different Avodah, so that's what's called B'shtei Avodas. So if so then the Sefer that's mentioning Lishma B'Shalai Lishma, obviously, what I mean, you already said this halach of one Lishma, one Shalai Lishma. Obviously it must be by one Avodah, and that's like Rabbi Yisi. Says, no, they're both come by 2 Avodas. So why are you repeating yourself? Why are you being redundant? The Reish is by that Avodah itself that you have in the Machshava Psul. The Sefer is you're by one Avodah and you have in the Machshava by a different Avodah, which the Chiddush is Ma'chash and Avodah L'Avodah, and if they're both come by Shtei Avodas, it never could even be like your Meir. The second raya was also from our Mishnah. We said either you do it Lishmai and Shalai Lishma, or Shalai Lishmai, but Lishmai can be possible. Now obviously that's about one Avodah, because by 2 different Avodas, if you told me then 2 Avodas by Lishmai B'Shalai Lishmai, then B'Shur Shalai Lishmai, the first one is sure going to be possible. And then if this one's by Dachas, then the other one's also by Dachas. So the Gemara, no, could be 2 different Avodas. You're right, and it's unnecessary. I need to turn the Lishmai B'Shalai Lishmai, to turn the Shalai Lishmai B'Lishmai. It's not a raya, it could be talking about 2 different Avodas. The third raya was in the next Mishnah. We said if you slaughtered Shalai L'Eichlav and all these other Psulim and Areilim and Tmeim and all these different things, we said that obviously it's about one Avodah, because like Rashi says, there's only one Machshava that you're having, obviously it's by one Avodah, you can't have by 2 different Avodas, by one Avodah, it's one Machshava. And if that Mishnah is by one Avodah, so our Mishnah is also by one Avodah, that's like your basis. Well, no, not necessarily. My area, Hakadisa, it's not necessarily, that Mishnah could be one Avodah, our Mishnah could be 2 different Avodas. Similarly, another right from that Mishnah was, we had a Machshava, L'Eichlav B'Shalai L'Eichlav. This is going to be kosher. Now, obviously that's even by one Avodah, because we know the halacha is mixed Eichel is kosher. So obviously it's even by one Avodah, and our Mishnah also by one Avodah. So the Gemara, no, again, Hakadisa is not a right. The Gemara did not prove if our Mishnah is by Avodah. Then we had an interesting question regarding Pesach, and you slaughtered any other day of the year, L'Shmai B'Shalai L'Shmai. Now here, the L'Shmai is the Pasal Machshava, the Shalai L'Shmai is the Kosher Machshava. So the question was, does the Shalai L'Shmai come along and remove it from the L'Shmai and make it kosher? So the first interpretation the Gemara says, well, it's the same thing like L'Shmai Bizmanoi, that we said doesn't remove it, because when you do it Shalai L'Shmai and L'Shma is not going to validate the Shalai L'Shma, so to Shalai L'Shma is not going to validate Shalai Bizmanoi from the L'Shma. So the Gemara, no, it's not a riot, because Shalai L'Shma Bizmanoi is by Kol HaZvachim, so that's a bona fide psul. So L'Shma cannot fix that, but the Shalai L'Shma of the Shlamim could fix the L'Shma of the Pesach, because that's a shmacha psul, it's only by carbon pesach. So it's not a raya. It could be that it would be valid. Then the Gemara says, okay, you're right, it's kosher, because by the carbon pesach, like any carbon, it's dama l'shma, and even so when you slaughter shalai l'shmai, shalai b'zman, it's going to be kosher, so even if you say it, it's going to remove it, just like remove it from the stomach. So the Gemara says, wait a second, no. Maybe it's different when you say, because you find by eichel b'shalai l'eichlav, that it's different than the stomach, when you say, because when it's stama, and you do only shalai la'eichel, it's going to be puzzle, but when you say la'eichel b'shalai la'eichel, it's going to be kosher, so you see that stama is different than amar, so it's not a raya. So that Rava says, no, the stama l'shma is different than the stama of eichel, because by eichel, you could remove yourself. It's not a definitive, who is the eichel, because people could come on and off, they could remove themselves. So therefore, yes, that's why by la'eichel, by shalai la'eichel, it's going to make it puzzle, and whereas la'eichel b'shalai la'eichel is not going to make it impossible. But by the Shema, we presume it's always going to be until you're acrid from it, and therefore, if you find that Shalai L'Shma on Shabbos Shana is going to make it valid, even though it's removing the stomach L'Shma, so even when you say L'Shma and then your Shalai L'Shma says Rabbah, it's also going to be kosher the same way. And you